And for more, let's speak with Rahm Emanuel, U.S. Ambassador to Japan. Mr. Emanuel was also mayor of Chicago, chief of staff to former U.S. President Barack Obama, and was elected 4 times as member of the House of Representatives. He joins us from Tokyo. Ambassador, thank you for joining us this morning. Let's start first with your response to these recent military moves by Russia close to Japan while Prime Minister Kishida was in Ukraine. It certainly makes the war in Ukraine feel closer to Asia.
Well, the war in Ukraine always felt closer to Asia. What Prime Minister Kishida did when he first got elected in October 2021 was ask for 3 strategic documents to be rewritten. And the defense budget, increasing from 1% to 2% of GDP, is a byproduct of that. And what's interesting, in the last year, the United States, the Republic of Korea, and Japan have all issued strategic documents. And all of them basically are complementary and coordinated in their vision of the area. And I think one of the things that Russia's trying to do, and in my own view in that, is not just send a message to Japan, but the flyover was really at the end of a trip. There are 2 things that I think come about. One is that Putin is clearly in Xi's pocket. There's no doubt about it. It's not an equal partnership. And number 2 that I think that is relevant is Prime Minister Kishida went to support the Ukrainian people who have had a war waged on them. And President Xi went to Moscow with somebody that's been indicted by the International Criminal Court for killing civilians and, more importantly, abducting children out of Ukraine. And upon Xi's departure, not even the wheels were up and the flaps were down. What do? They send cruise missiles into an apartment building, killing 7 people. That tells you, to the world, what kind of future you want. And I think that the acts by Russia, whether it's here in the Far East or in Kiev, or in Odessa or Kherson area or Kharkiv, all tell you one thing. That is not a world that the people around the world want to be part of.
It's an interesting time for you to be in Japan, Ambassador, given we're in the midst of what appears to be a paradigm shift. Tokyo, sharply increasing its defense spending, distancing itself from its pacifist posture. And Japan has said that it will acquire hundreds of American Tomahawk cruise missiles. Now, some say that this evolution signals that America and Japan are seriously preparing for a major conflict in the region. Is that the case?
Well, no, I think the way to look at this is active deterrence. And first of all, what Japan's done in the defense area is complementary to what the other 2 Ds that have been pillars of their national security: development and diplomacy, now with an active defense and deterrence. That is how you should view this. And I do think when you look at the region, just look at the last 2 years, President Biden's total approach of energizing allies and alliances to work together. You have a rapprochement between South Korea and Japan. You have Japan increasing its defense and diplomatic efforts in the region. You have the Philippines, Japan, and the United States actively engaged in discussions about economic and strategic cooperation. You have Australia investing in AUKUS and a revitalized Quad with India's participation. Every neighbor in the last 4 months, let alone the last 4 years, of China, they have attacked India on the border of the Himalayas twice. They've attacked the Coast Guard of the Philippines in the last 4 months twice. They have sent a spy balloon over the United States. They've attacked Canada and Australia's naval exercises. They have also, not only about 50 straight days into the Senkaku Islands of Japan, they fired missiles into the Japan's EEZ. That is what they've done just the last 4 months. Now, they may see it as containment. The rest of the region that is close to China sees it as deterrence. So I don't think it's preparing. And if you want to avoid a conflict, the best way to avoid a conflict is an active, engaged, and strategically thought through deterrence. And every country in the region that borders China is actively involved in one way or another with robust deterrence because they know what an unhinged China is. And the truth is, when you look at what China's been doing, this is really a reaction to the failed wolf warrior strategy of the last 7 years. They have done more to isolate themselves than any other person can do to them. It's not containment. It's deterrence, because China's wolf warrior strategy, their economic coercion, their economic espionage, and their buildup of a defense that is in constant conflict with their neighbors has put everybody in the region on edge. That is the origination of the problem. And what they see as somewhat a containment strategy or somewhat as preparing for a conflict, every country in the region is actively involved on the diplomatic front and the defense and deterrence front to deter China from a very aggressive behavior on the diplomatic front, the economic front, and the defense policy.
With this active deterrence, as you've described it, is Washington trying to establish a NATO-like organization in the Indo-Pacific?
No. I mean, that is just a mythology that's built as basically a piñata to punch. This is countries of like-minded. Now, here's what I would do is take a step back. One, over the last 8 years, the wolf warrior strategy of China has backfired and backflipped on them and been an isolating rather than an engaging strategy. Two, I've always viewed in the last 3.5 years the 3 C's that have changed the world: COVID, conflict, and coercion. The supply chain problems of COVID, the conflict in Ukraine showing what Russia will do to the UN Charter in total disregard for rules and international system that everybody abides by, that participates in the international system, and China's active, engaged economic coercion and undermining and subversion of other countries' economic independence. So every country, including the United States, is in an active engagement of reassessing and reassigning resources based on the 3 C's and the assumptions associated with those 3 C's that have changed the world. You're not going back to a pre-COVID era. You're not going back to a pre-conflict era, and you're definitely not continuing on a strategy which allows China's economic coercion. And the United States, its allies, whether it's on the defense side, the economic side, or the diplomatic side, is involved in some way realigning its resources, its strategy, to adjust to a world changed by COVID, conflict, and coercion. That's what's going on. And it's not about a NATO. It's about like-minded countries realizing that their economic security, their national security, and their political security all depend about coming together and working together. And the instigator and the kind of core and crux of this is China and Russia undermining all the assumptions of a more collaborative and cooperative world. And people don't want to be a part of that. It's definitely not one unhinged of a China that economically and national security looks at, does, and what it does in the South China Seas, along the Himalayas, or in any other internationally recognized space. No country wants to be part of that. And what China is now reacting to is they see other countries actively involved in the diplomatic side, actively involved in the development side, and actively involved in the defense side, because they know that working together is a better defense against China's kind of coercion and Russia's kind of conflict.
Okay, Ambassador, you talk about like-minded nations coming together. The Quad, Japan, India, U.S., and Australia, obviously they are working to try and contain, deal with China. But how can the Quad be effective when the members' economies are so intertwined with that of China?
Well, first of all, I'm going to call you out. The Quad is not about containing. Remember, there was a period of time where China was welcomed in as a full partner. They actively, both on the diplomatic side with Wolf Warrior, active with economic espionage and international and intellectual property espionage, and then active with economic coercion, where they targeted Japan at one time, Australia at one time, the Philippines at one time, the Korea at one time, Lithuania at one time. Every country has come together not to contain. That was never the strategy. But given what China's done, it is to deter an unhinged, unlocked China that literally does not abide by any respect for a country. The second is, when you ask about the Quad, yes, they're willing to have economic trade. The United States does. But what we won't do is allow you to steal our intellectual property and act like you're abiding by the rules. Wink, wink. We won't let you undermine another country's system. Take the Philippines, where China, in the South China Sea, went after the Philippines' islands, the mineral, the energy, the fishing rights, targeting their Coast Guard. And then when the International Maritime Court rules against China, they summarily dismiss it and they ignore it. That is not a full partner. So you got to go back to the origination of the action that requires then a country to adjust. China actively undermined not just the World Trade Organization, but a system in which a case was taken to them on the maritime, take the Philippines waters in the South China Sea, ruled against China, and China said, we're going to ignore it. Now, you cannot continue along a path as if that doesn't matter. Take ASML, the semiconductor company. It's now pretty clear China had a spy inside stealing intellectual property. Are you going to act like that event did not occur? I think countries around the world have woken up and said, this is not a benign China that's part of a system. This is a China that's trying to undermine that system. Then, therefore, countries react. And so you have to find the point of origin that underpins the set of reactions by countries. China was always welcomed in and a respected member of the international community. It is the constant undermining of that system, not abiding by the rules that other countries were abiding by, not abiding by the systems holding each country accountable to abide by those rules, that then made every country realize, you know what? We have to work together because we share one premise, that the rules apply to all of us equally. But when another country, part of that system, consciously goes out to undermine not only the rules, but disregard them, you cannot act like that did not happen. You'd be a fool.
Ambassador, one last question for you. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is...
Two last answers.
Yes, I'm looking forward to them. The Russia invasion of Ukraine has raised questions of China's relationship with Taiwan and its stated ambitions of reunification by force if necessary. Yeah. What's the U.S. position on this, given that Secretary of State Antony Blinken just recently said that the stakes in Ukraine go well beyond Ukraine and has a profound impact on Asia? He also added that everyone is watching to see how the U.S. and the world respond to this aggression, and they'll draw their lessons from it.
Well, I think the country, the United States, the Biden administration, like every other administration, has been very clear. The policy as it relates to Taiwan goes back very clearly from every president, regardless of Democrat or Republican, has been asserted. And so there's nothing more for me to add. But I do think what is clear, and I think what the Secretary of State was saying, Russia is a founding member of the United Nations. Being a founding member of the United Nations requires you to abide by the rules and the premise upholding the international system. You do not unilaterally violate the sovereignty and independence of another nation. That is what's happening in the war in Ukraine, let alone the brutal attack on civilians, the brutal attack on the energy system, the brutal attack on other countries' food security, and the brutal attack on Europe's energy independence. Russia undermined that system. And when you say that, it's obviously, like the Prime Minister Kishida announced, what happens in Ukraine yesterday could impact Asia tomorrow. But that's also true around the globe, which is why I thought one of the most powerful things going back over a year ago in the debate at the United Nations on the March 3rd resolution condemning Russia's action came from the Kenyan ambassador, from the African Union, who spoke up on the idea of the sovereignty of an independent nation, of another country violating that. Every country in Africa, based on the geographic boundaries, could spend their entire resources fighting those lines. Rather than look to the past, they realized that their responsibilities as governments and civil servants was to look to a future and build it. If Russia is allowed to get away with undermining the international system and the UN Charter, then nothing is sacrosanct as it relates to any other country and their border and their countries on their border. And either we uphold that principle that by and large has worked, good days and bad days, but by and large has worked as an international North Star, or we totally throw that out. Now, if that's the world that you want to live in, or people around the world want to live in, great. I don't think when you look at the kids in Tehran, when you look at the people starving in North Korea, you look at the people arrested in Hong Kong, or you look at the million people fleeing Moscow and St. Petersburg and the young men who are sent into literally to be churned up in Bakhmut, that the people of either Iran, North Korea, China, or Russia, who have an intimate knowledge of those governments, who are fleeing in one way or another, want to be part of that world. Never lose sight of the seductive pull of freedom. it has an incredible pull on both the heart and the mind.
Ambassador, it's clear the U.S. sees the Ukraine conflict as not only a regional war, but one with high moral and strategic stakes. But, some nations think Washington's approach of isolating, condemning Russia is really not the way to peace, and that efforts should focus on a negotiated settlement. So how do you see this conflict ending? How far is Washington willing to go to support Kyiv?
I knew I was going to get two final questions, not one. But let me say this. First of all, I don't agree with the premise, if I could. Teresa, think about this. 80% of the ASEAN countries voted to condemn Russia's invasion. 75% of the African Union countries did. 83% of the Latin American countries did. That is not countries that agree with Russia's violation of the UN Charter that every country signed up for when they were joining the United Nations. So I don't agree with the premise of somehow other countries are seduced by Russia's argument. Look in this area, in this region, China is singularly the most unpopular country in this region. And international polls, Pew polls, show that. So I don't buy this continuation of this premise that's put out by both Beijing and Moscow that somehow the rest of the world doesn't accept the notion or the argument, both moral, political, or strategic, put out by the United States. The numbers don't bear that out. Now, we have our work out to do. We have been, in many cases, our own worst enemy on that premise. But don't kid yourself when 80%, 83%, and 75% voted against Russia's war that somehow their argument is winning the day. I don't buy that. And the numbers don't bear it out. They don't bear it out over a year. Now, in the end of the day, this is bigger than my pay grade. I'm the ambassador for the United States to Japan. There will be other people that will weigh in on how this will end. But I will tell you one thing that we know today, regardless of where the lines are or when the guns go quiet. The entire idea that somehow there is not a Ukrainian people or Ukrainian language or Ukrainian culture identity, Putin failed on that. The idea that NATO somehow encroached into Russia, no. Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, they moved west. NATO did not move east. And Sweden and Finland are joining that unity of defense. When also Russia wanted to prove that they were a world power, they're now dependent on Iran and North Korea to just survive. So at every premise that he was trying to project, he has failed. So I don't know how the war ends, but I know who has failed in this endeavor. That is Putin. And unfortunately, the Russian people will have to live with the consequences of President Putin's failure in the policy, not only in Ukraine, but also in the neighbors. Look at how Kazakhstan's acting. Look at how Armenia is acting. Look how Moldova is acting. Nobody wants to be a part of the Russian orbit. The EU, the democratic countries, the capitalist countries, countries based on the premise of respect for the individual and freedom, have a pull on the emotional attachment of the countries and the peoples around Russia. They do not want to be part of that orbit. That is also true here in the Indo-Pacific. If you look at the regions of the countries bordering either Russia or China, who are most intimately knowledgeable about the actions of both Russia and China, they're the most vocal about an international system based on rules. That tells you something.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your time this morning. We asked you many more questions than we had planned to, but we appreciate all your answers. Rahm Emanuel, the U.S. Ambassador to Japan, thank you for joining us.
I have more answers than questions. Thanks.